Clara Myers thought she was walking home like any other night, unaware that the man in the torn coat had already chosen her. Lena Torres, analyzing the footage, realized too late that Ridgemont's quiet streets hid a predator who had been stalking victims for months, and now no one was safe. The town of Ridgemont moved at a slow, predictable rhythm, the kind that made people feel safe without ever questioning why. Every evening the same routines repeated themselves: porch lights switching on, dogs barking at nothing, and neighbors exchanging brief waves before disappearing into their warm homes. It was a place where danger felt distant, almost impossible, as if nothing truly dark could survive in such calm surroundings. That belief shattered on a cold Wednesday night when Clara Myers did not make it home. Clara was known for her strict routine. She always left work at the same time, followed the same street, and reached her house before the clock struck 10. When she failed to arrive, her family assumed she was delayed. But as the hours passed and her phone went silent, worry turned into fear. By dawn, police were checking the route she walked every night. That was when they retrieved the footage from a convenience store camera near the old railway station. Officers expected to see Clara walking alone as usual. Instead, they watched a tall man in a dark coat trailing several steps behind her. The man never moved too close, yet his presence felt intentional, almost practiced. He followed her until both figures slipped behind the abandoned freight building, a spot where the camera view cut off completely. After that moment, Clara simply vanished. No screams were recorded. No one nearby reported strange sounds. It was as if the darkness behind that building swallowed her whole. The police were left with a shadowy figure whose face remained hidden and a growing sense that Ridgemont's peaceful reputation had been masking something dangerous for far longer than anyone realized. Clara's disappearance spread through Ridgemont faster than anyone expected. People who once walked freely at night now hesitated before stepping outside, sensing an invisible threat moving among them. As police reviewed old case files for anything similar, a disturbing truth emerged. Clara was not the only one who had vanished without explanation. In the past 6 months, 3 other women had gone missing under strangely similar circumstances. Each case had been treated as isolated, caused by personal problems or random misfortune. No one had considered the possibility that they were connected. The pattern only became clear when detectives compared the CCTV footage from different parts of town. In each clip, just minutes before a woman disappeared, a tall figure in a dark coat appeared in the background. His movements were slow and controlled, never drawing attention. Sometimes he stood across the street, other times he appeared only for a few seconds, but his presence was unmistakable once the videos were placed side by side. The realization sent a shiver through the investigative team. A single person had been quietly stalking victims while the entire town slept in ignorance. The more details the police gathered, the more unsettling the picture became. All the disappearances happened on quiet streets with limited lighting and minimal foot traffic. Each woman vanished after leaving work or returning home, timing that suggested careful planning. What frightened investigators even more was that the man seemed to understand the blind spots of every camera in Ridgemont. He slipped through areas with precision, staying invisible just long enough to avoid detection. As word spread, residents began taking precautions, but the damage had already been done. There was a growing belief that Ridgemont was not dealing with random crimes. Something far more calculated was unfolding in the heart of their town, and no one knew when it would strike again. The investigators spent days enhancing every blurry recording they had collected, hoping to find a face, a scar, or anything that could identify the mysterious man in the dark coat. But every attempt revealed the same unsettling truth: he was always aware of the cameras. He never looked up, never exposed his profile, and never stepped into the frame long enough for technology to capture a clear image. His lowered head and steady pace made him appear more like a shadow than a person. It was as though he studied the town long before choosing his victims. A crime analyst named Lena Torres was the first to focus on a detail most people would overlook. On the right shoulder of the man's coat, there was a small tear, tiny, but visible across multiple clips. It wasn't the kind of flaw that happened by accident. It looked old, frayed at the edges, and unchanged over months. This consistency made investigators uneasy. Serial criminals often kept trophies, but this man seemed to keep a piece of clothing as a signature, a silent announcement that he was returning again and again. Lena reviewed footage frame by frame, comparing his posture, stride length, and the angles at which he avoided the cameras. Every movement suggested careful planning. He knew exactly where each lens pointed and how to slip past unnoticed. It felt less like a person improvising and more like someone following a well-rehearsed script. The team began to suspect that the man didn't fear being recognized. Instead, he seemed to enjoy being just visible enough for police to know he existed, yet skilled enough to deny them anything useful. That deliberate control made him even more dangerous. Ridgemont wasn't just dealing with a predator, it was being watched by someone who understood every weakness in the town's security. When investigators reviewed additional footage from the bus terminal near Clara's last recorded location, they noticed something that shifted the entire direction of the case. The man in the torn coat did not simply follow Clara randomly. He guided her. His small, calculated movements, unnoticed before, pointed her toward a narrow path behind a fenced-off area. That path led directly to an abandoned house on Brookline Road, a place most residents avoided. The structure had been empty ever since a fire damaged its upper level 8 years earlier. Locals said the property felt cursed, but no one had a clear reason why. It had simply become part of Ridgemont's forgotten landscape. When police arrived at the site, the air around it felt strangely still, as if the house itself held its breath. The windows were covered in grime, and the yard was choked with overgrown weeds. Layers of soot remained on the walls, reminders of the old fire. Inside, every step stirred clouds of dust that glittered in the thin rays of light breaking through cracks in the ceiling. Officers noticed that although most of the floor was blanketed in untouched grime, a faint set of footprints traveled toward the back of the structure. The prints were recent. The deeper investigators moved into the house, the more they sensed something was wrong. The walls bore marks of someone returning frequently, scratches, shifted boards, and disturbed debris. A rusted metal bucket sat in one corner, filled with items that did not belong there, torn pieces of cloth, empty bottles, and something that looked like burnt paper. What unsettled the team the most was the feeling that the house had been used for far more than shelter. It felt like a place chosen with purpose, a hidden space where someone had carried out plans in secret for months, maybe even years. In the basement of the abandoned house, investigators discovered a detail that confirmed their worst fears. A loose wooden panel along the far wall looked slightly out of place, its edges cleaner than the rest of the area. When officers pushed it aside, they uncovered a hidden room that seemed untouched by time. The air inside was stale, almost suffocating, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings, each one carefully cut and pinned with precision. Every article focused on a missing woman from Ridgemont. The dates and locations matched the cases that detectives had linked only days earlier. In the center of the room stood a small table covered with objects taken from victims. Some items were recognizable, fragments of clothing, a broken bracelet, a burnt ID card, while others were too damaged to identify. Each piece appeared deliberately arranged, as if part of a private catalog only the killer understood. There was no visible chaos, no sign of rushed movements. Everything had been placed with eerie patience. A narrow shelf next to the table held a row of VHS tapes. Their labels were written in neat handwriting, each marked with a date corresponding to a disappearance. The realization struck the team slowly but heavily. The killer had recorded something connected to each victim. These tapes were not trophies, they were records, pieces of a ritual he returned to repeatedly. One of the detectives picked up the most recent tape. The label matched the night Clara vanished. The weight of it felt wrong, almost too meaningful. The entire room suggested a person who needed to relive his actions, someone who studied his crimes after committing them. It wasn't just cruelty, it was obsession. And that obsession made it clear the killer was far from finished. The detectives gathered around the small television brought into the abandoned basement, their nerves tight as they prepared to watch the most recent tape. The screen flickered to life with distorted lines, followed by shaky footage that looked as though it had been recorded with an old handheld camera. The image showed the familiar dark coat with the torn shoulder, confirming immediately that the tape belonged to the same person seen in every CCTV clip. The camera seemed to be positioned behind a cluster of bushes, facing a dimly lit street on the night Clara disappeared. Through the grainy film, Clara appeared walking her usual route, completely unaware she was being watched. The figure in the coat stood several steps behind her, moving with slow, deliberate actions that mirrored everything seen on the surveillance footage. But what unsettled investigators most was how the killer adjusted the camera as if perfecting the angle, making sure the moment was captured exactly how he wanted it. The recording cut off before anything violent occurred, leaving a haunting sense of incompleteness. It felt intentional, as if the killer wanted the police to see just enough to confirm his involvement but not enough to reveal his identity or method. When detectives examined the tape labels again, a chilling discovery emerged. One tape was marked with a future date, an evening that had not yet arrived. This meant the killer wasn't simply recording past acts, he was planning ahead and documenting his intentions before carrying them out. The team realized they were no longer investigating old crimes but racing against time to stop the next one. The feeling in the room shifted from dread to urgency. Someone in Ridgemont was already chosen as the next target, and the countdown had silently begun. Police presence grew heavier across Ridgemont as the date on the labeled tape approached. Officers rotated through long night shifts, studying the patterns of the killer's previous movements and comparing them with the layout of the streets. Crestview Avenue stood out immediately. It was a long residential road with old streetlights that flickered at random and houses spaced far apart. It matched the conditions of every previous disappearance: low visibility, minimal traffic, and a perfect mixture of isolation and silence. Detectives believed the killer had chosen it carefully, expecting the same advantage he always relied on. On the evening marked on the tape, squads were discreetly positioned along the avenue. Some officers hid inside unmarked vehicles, barely visible through tinted windows. Others used the shadows of fences and parked vans to conceal themselves, waiting for the slightest movement. The air felt unnaturally cold, carrying a tension that made even the smallest sound sharper. Hours passed without activity, and for a moment, the team wondered if the killer had outsmarted them again. At 11:47 p.m., a figure finally appeared at the far end of the street. The torn coat was unmistakable, even from a distance. The man walked at his usual steady pace, unbothered, as though he were taking a quiet evening stroll. A woman turned the corner behind him, heading home from her late shift, unaware she had stepped directly into the predicted pattern. The killer's timing was perfect, mirroring every detail seen on the tapes. Just before he reached the section of Crestview where the cameras had blind spots, officers received the signal. They moved in simultaneously from multiple angles, breaking the silence with rapid footsteps and flashing lights. It was the first time the killer had ever been confronted. The trap was finally in motion, and Ridgemont held its breath for what would come next. The moment officers closed in, the calmness the killer displayed on camera vanished, replaced by a burst of speed that shocked everyone watching. He pivoted sharply toward a narrow alley beside an old repair shop, slipping through the opening before the closest officer could reach him. The chase began instantly. Flashlights sliced through the darkness as detectives sprinted after him, their footsteps echoing against metal walls and empty dumpsters. But the killer moved with a level of confidence that suggested he had rehearsed this escape route many times before. He darted between storage sheds, crossed behind delivery trucks, and squeezed through gaps too tight for most adults. Every turn seemed intentional, as if he had memorized the layout of the industrial district long before the police realized his pattern. Officers shouted directions to each other, trying to corner him, but he kept slipping out of reach. A patrol car attempted to cut him off near the back entrance of a factory, but he changed direction at the last second, vaulting over a crate and disappearing behind a stack of metal pallets. In the frantic pursuit, something caught an officer's eye, a dark object lying near a loading dock. When they reached it, the discovery sent a ripple of confusion and frustration through the team. It was the coat. The same coat with the torn shoulder that had connected every crime on record. Dropping it seemed deliberate, as if he wanted to shed his old identity right there in front of them. Without the coat, the killer blended into the maze of warehouses and machinery, becoming just another figure in the night. The officers searched for nearly an hour, but he was nowhere to be found. Ridgemont realized with painful clarity that they had come close, unbelievably close, only for him to vanish once again, proving he understood the town's weaknesses better than anyone. 2 days after the failed pursuit, investigators were exhausted yet unwilling to slow down. They reviewed hours of footage from cameras across the industrial district, hoping the killer's escape route might reveal something new. Late in the evening, a security company emailed the police with footage flagged by their automated system. The message mentioned unusual activity recorded inside a warehouse that had been inactive for months. Detectives opened the file expecting another meaningless lead, but what appeared on the screen instantly froze the room. The killer stood in the center of the warehouse, framed by stacks of unused crates. For the first time, he wasn't avoiding the camera. Instead, he faced it directly, as if he wanted the police to know he had returned. His face was concealed behind a crude mask made from pieces of stitched fabric, its uneven seams giving it a disturbing, almost handmade appearance. Though no features were visible, the mask felt more unsettling than a clear face might have. There was something intentional in its design, something that suggested the mask itself held meaning for him. Behind him sat a woman tied to a metal chair. She fit the description of a newly reported missing resident, confirming their worst fear that he had already chosen another victim. The way she slumped indicated she was unconscious but alive. The killer lifted one hand and slowly raised a finger to the camera, a silent signal that felt like a warning or a countdown. Then, without any sound, the video abruptly went black. Investigators traced the feed to a warehouse on the far side of the district, one located beyond the killer's previous patterns. This wasn't an accident. He wanted them to find it. He wanted them to come. The trap he intended was not yet clear, but the urgency in the room shifted instantly. They had found him again, but this time, he was waiting. Police moved quickly, coordinating every unit to storm the warehouse as quietly as possible, hoping to catch the killer before he acted. When they arrived, the heavy metal door creaked under forceful pressure, revealing the dim interior. Inside, the missing woman sat slumped in the chair, her breathing shallow but steady. Officers immediately untied her and checked for injuries. She was alive, but clearly terrified, her eyes darting across the room as if expecting the killer to appear from the shadows at any moment. Relief mixed with tension, he was here moments before, and yet he had vanished. On the floor lay the mask he had worn in the surveillance footage. Its rough stitching and eerie expression seemed almost taunting, as if the killer left it intentionally for the police to find. Every detective who entered felt the weight of the object, the unspoken challenge in the way it rested on the dusty floor. The coat, once so distinct and identifying, was nowhere in sight. He had prepared this escape meticulously, leaving only the mask behind as a symbol of his presence. Then the team reviewed the cameras that still recorded the warehouse exterior. The footage showed a figure slipping silently through a vent in the ceiling, barely visible as he melted into the surrounding shadows. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, and no trace of his DNA. The killer had planned the exit down to the smallest detail, anticipating every move the police would make. He disappeared behind a parked truck, and by the time officers checked the area, he was gone. The realization hit like a cold wave, the killer was still free. He had left proof of his crimes, a living victim, and yet no one could follow him. Ridgemont had witnessed the capture of the moment but not the person. The streets were quiet again, but beneath that calm, the shadow of the killer remained, watching, waiting, and ready to strike once more.